Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm very glad that we can have this discussion about Palestine. It's the most important thing, period, happening. Where should we begin?
We're really analytically true to form here.
Yeah. Well, what did we say before we started recording? We can talk about why analysts are so terrible about Palestine. That's a good place to start.
I mean, it feels glaring, right? It was glaring. We're 8+ months into a genocide. Every day feels more horrible than the next. Every day there's a way in which I'll personally speak that my heart shatters into a million pieces and also grows and is expansive in terms of what we're able to commit to, what we're seeing folks rally around the world. It feels like parts, let's say institutional psychoanalysis lack is so much more on display now, more than ever, and in terms of our ethical duties and ethical imperatives. So I know I joined to be able to not allow people the luxury of innocence.
And you just published that really powerful piece about this, Lara, and your experience.
It never ceases to amaze me how mainstream psychoanalysis doesn't seem to worry about its ability to be on the wrong side of history. That there's this kind of originary historical trauma that almost it, however many times we've subsequently seen psychoanalysis really, really come down on the wrong side. And I think Avgi has written about this with trans issues really beautifully. There's just a sense that whatever we tend to think must be the right thing, and such a striking lack of institutional and individual self-criticism. It's really persistent, being at least for me, surprising, unsurprising, and disappointing.
I mean, I was quiet when you asked the question, Vanessa, because I feel like there's there's so many feelings and so many places to go with what's happening, and so many allied domains in which psychoanalysis has really messed up. Like what you were saying, Carter, really speaks to me. And there's many people in this room who have written or are writing about these issues that I have a lot of respect for. So I'm very glad to be in your company. But I'm also very acutely aware of how rare that is, and how rare it is to find other analysts who are willing to speak, not just think, not just critique, but actually speak up, including the risk and the danger that comes with it, which of course is negligible compared to what's actually happening in the world. But how frightened psychoanalysis is overall to take positions, even as kind of the repetition of being on the wrong side of history vis-a-vis trans, vis-a-vis all kinds of historical issues is kind of we would hope that as psychoanalysts, we would be able to think about that. And yet what we see happening is exactly the opposite, the shutting down of conversation, the constant, if not pathologization and demonization, the constant kind of on the one hand, it's the demonization. On the other hand, it's the complete erasure of these voices. Like in my institute, for example, these conversations cannot be had at all. So I join Lara in thanking you, Vanessa, for providing one of the few spaces where this conversation can happen publicly.
Yeah, I'm glad I can do that.
Hi, thank you so much for this, Vanessa, and bringing us together. Yeah, I find myself pausing because I think that like, what is psychoanalysis when it's named as psychoanalysis? I think like the institution is not, this isn't an exception. It's not like, you know, other institutions are showing up for Palestine and psychoanalysis is lagging behind. I think this is like a tell sign of like what this practice has become like ensconced within and what it represents. And yeah, there are psychoanalysts like, you know, folks sitting in this room who speak for Palestine, who speak for trans rights, who just name these things. And I think that what we're noticing is the logics that psychoanalysis always recalibrates to. What is the equilibrium that it's setting forth? And I've heard in a lot of spaces of folks that are speaking for and with Palestinians of kind of saying like, well, is psychoanalysis sufficient? Like in the end, can we really utilize psychoanalysis? And I like this question and I dislike it. I like it because there's an aspect of like understanding psychoanalysis as a tool, as an instrument. And I dislike it because it almost puts that utility and instrumentalization only towards one direction, forgoing all of those radical analysts that we have, that we continue to build upon what they've offered. And I think it's very clear, like, why hasn't the institution of psychoanalysis spoken about it? Because it's embedded within white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchal, ableist notions. That is where it is. And I really do believe that the folks in this room are pulling it, are looking at it from the margins, which allows for a different perspective of psychoanalysis and this work in the alterity. But I don't really believe that it's shocking that psychoanalysis hasn't spoken on Palestine.
I think one thing that's happening is that we are being forced to learn to speak again about oppression. And we're having to combat the betrayal of psychoanalysis after the diaspora formed during the Second World War with the rise of the Nazis in continental Europe. If we look back at psychoanalysis before then, we see many psychoanalysts who were involved in opposition movements, involved as members or supporters of the communist parties or the socialist parties, who were willing to speak out in the political realm as citizens, as activists, as well as functioning as psychoanalysts, and not willing to simply see psychoanalysis as the individualizing of a problem to be dealt with simply in the clinic with the resolution of problems on a one-to-one basis. That is, many psychoanalysts were thinking about culture and society, and maybe they were applying that in a reductive way. Okay, we have some criticisms of that, but they were attempting to do that. And that has been betrayed by psychoanalysis in recent years with the implantation of psychoanalysis in Western culture and the adaptation of psychoanalysis in the United States and certainly in Britain. So we're learning something about our history. We're being forced to learn something about a history and about what psychoanalysis could be. It's a real question for us, which is a theoretical and practical question. So I think that when we're speaking out as psychoanalysts about genocide in Gaza, we're doing what psychoanalysis should be doing. And the mainstream institutions now that have so well adapted to their societies with private practice concerned simply with individual solutions to social problems, those institutions are trying to make it seem as if we're the outsiders, as if we're the oddballs who are saying something strange. No, we're not. We're speaking of psychoanalysis, as psychoanalysts should do in this context. So we have a real institutional battle. And to go what Razzan was saying just now, we're learning from the impact of the decolonial movements and the feminist movements and the trans movements, our sisters and brothers involved in struggle about what it means to speak. We're having to do that. It's a real task for us.
Ian, I want to I wanted to frame it as a question, but I don't know if it's a question. And I appreciate your wisdom. You know, I'm a fresh graduate, and I'm still very early in this field. But like, when I look at the recent history of psychoanalysis as an institution, let's say as a body, there has been the ability to speak out. You know, so I wonder about this question, if it's like for psychoanalysis to find and tap into its voice again, or if it's about like that it's actually like showing itself, because psychoanalysis has demonstrated that it is able to come out and speak out when there are matters that betrust and are also like kind of nourishing to its own presence as is. And I'm thinking specifically about speaking about certain forms of massacres and violence versus not others, specifically aligning more with the kind of imperialist narrative and logic. And you know, there's like been so many like waves of identifying, like psychoanalysts identifying themselves as, I am this identity, and so come to me. And I feel like, so there's a way of like being able to speak out, but it's just like with Palestine in specific and with trans rights also, I feel like it's a different kind of like there's too much to lose here. And that's how I feel psychoanalysis has betrayed itself, because my understanding, or what lured me into psychoanalysis, was the understanding that there's pain and hardship in this, right? Like to know oneself, to dig deep within it, to claim one's sovereignty, sense of the self-sovereignty. That's not a wow, like amazing, pleasurable experience. There's a lot of grit and pain that goes into it. And what I find is that like many, like the dominant psychoanalysts that are kind of holding these psychoanalytic institutions have given up on that. They're very like lulled and sedated by this idea that I don't want to have to push against something to come into this other arena. I'm very quelled and comforted in where I am, but they're able to speak. I don't know if that's making sense, but that's
Totally.
what came
And they
It
choose
really is
not
a
to.
yes, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
You know, something I'm writing about in this shameless self-promotion, something I'm writing about in this book right now is the idea of the Psychoanalytic Institute and its governing bodies as fulfilling a chamber of commerce function. You know, that like the institutional structure of an institute is actually to funnel people into the private businesses of particularly senior members, right? And that if they don't do that well, the institution collapses because its utility for the senior members goes away. And the more I think about it, the more it's like, you know, why does Target do some things for Pride Month and not others, right? Like, you know, that we can see so clearly like where, you know, where they feel like their capitalist imperative is served by a certain kind of like political speech, and where they're afraid. And you know, it just feels like really, really loud to me, like the kind of the like the way in which in psychoanalysis your reputation is also your business, right? Because we don't know, I mean, none of us know how the other people in the room do therapy, right? Like we all make these referrals on the basis of like, well, they seem like a sagacious person, or they seem like somebody who I would respect. And so you know, the monetization of your reputation makes doing things like this, like I think a lot of people in this room have experienced it very directly, like dangerous and materially destabilizing, you know, to like stick your neck out on this stuff. And like, you know, yeah, like there's a lot on the line, you know, even as I think it's correct to say, like, clearly it is not the same as having the walls blown off of your apartment and having all of your relatives killed, right? But, you know, living in our own little world of like being worried about our material concerns and like, how are we going to, you know, make it all work for us? Like, yeah, there's risk.
I think there's a kind of fiction of neutrality and keeping out of politics. And yeah, thanks, Razzan. That reminds us, I suppose, of the kind of the parameters within which psychoanalysts are able to speak about politics. And often they speak as if it's not really political, as if they're kind of making a commentary and offering some knowledge. And they're able to do that kind of thing. And most psychoanalysts, when they do that, in my opinion, are pretty clueless about politics. They think that they're keeping away from politics, but by default, they insinuate a certain kind of politics into every statement that they make. And I suppose we're kind of reaping the whirlwind of that now around Gaza, because they're faced with something where they have to take a position. They can't simply comment and offer some insightful kind of interpretation without actually taking a position. And so what position do they take? They take the position of the Israeli state and the kind of narratives that are being spun by Zionists who want to prioritize the existence of the Israeli state and the eradication of Palestinian voices from the world. So it's a kind of there's political speech, but it's within certain boundaries which are really dangerous for us now.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate this. And Ian, I think one of the things that you were saying is I do think that there are people that are practicing how to flex a muscle to speak and speak, you know, I don't want to say fearlessly, back to Carter's point, because I think people have genuine fear. And I think we can see the disciplining tax of the state, you know, of institutions, of monetary capitalism, all the sorts of things. But that is, for me, different than not having spoken. Because I started off by saying I'm not allowing folks their innocence. And Psychoanalysis Institute has spoken. It has spoken of Zionism and the Israeli state and the supremacy of Jewish Israeli lives over Palestinians. It is not that long ago that IPA put out its horrendous statement, and then the follow-up one, and then the follow-up one. So I kind of want to underscore here that there has been a speaking, and that speaking has been against Palestinian life. And there needs to be, for me, in our sort of, you know, moving this through and saying, what is the next step? What is it that those of us who have been fighting these struggles, and in interconnect, I don't think it's by chance that Palestine and trans issues have been brought up over and over and over again in this, just in this short period of time we've been here, that those of us who have dedicated, who have taken the chances, because it's the ethical position to take, and it's one that aligns us with the ethos of our work, with the alleviation of psychic suffering, which is intertwined with structural oppression, right? And sort of dismantling structural oppression. I think the next step is for us also, not to wait for the narrative to change, but for us to start really reading and acknowledging and saying what is actually happening. What is actually happening is an action. It's not something we're waiting for. This is something Avgi taught me very early on. Like, when you're looking for an action, the action has already happened, folks. It has already happened. And I think we need to tell the story like this, that psychoanalysts have already chosen a side by and large. And those are the people that I will remind for the rest of time that they are supporting a genocide, that they are supporting, not only is the state now known as Israel carrying out that genocide, but the American imperial war machine also joining them. It was just 2 days ago that a quote unquote humanitarian aid pier was used as a Trojan horse to slaughter people, right? These are things that are actually happening, and analysts are on that side by and large.
I'm also thinking about, kind of like as I'm hearing you say this, Lara, also about what Ian was saying earlier, and kind of like, and thinking with repetition here, that kind of like this Trojan horse metaphor of kind of like humanitarian aid, or aid that is actually destructive, that offers itself as kind of like enters a space in the guise of protectionism, is kind of like psychoanalysis's method throughout. All kinds of, like, it's been the same thing with like trans rights. It's been the same thing with thinking about homosexuality, with thinking about kind of like, it's always for the well-being of someone. It's always in the name of somebody's well-being that psychoanalysis has done its most destructive act. So my curiosity is also going in the direction of what does it mean for us, kind of like those of us who are seeing what's happening as a genocide, to begin to divest emotionally from the fantasy that psychoanalysis will save us. Or this is not to give up on psychoanalysis, it's actually to ask more of it. To divest from the fantasy that kind of like that if we mount strong, rational, legitimate critiques, that stands to do anything in the world, which I think it doesn't. These are all like kind of like deep attachments. And they are attachment not just to the Zionist project or to heteronormativity or cisnormativity, they're also attachments to the preservation of psychoanalysis as an unchanged and unchangeable method. Kind of like a method that is not going to encounter kind of like encounter difficulty in a way that causes it to transform and reform itself, but which actually doubles down in these encounters. And all it's interested in doing is kind of like just constituting itself more, like doubling down. So I'm really interested also about what it means for us who are kind of like allied with this way of thinking. Like, what lessons can we take from this, and how can we use that for the future to build different kinds of ways of thinking and ways of responding to what should by now be an expectable kind of exercise of silence or speech, depending, like going back to what Razzan was pointing out about like psychoanalysis can speak. Yes, but psychoanalysis mostly speaks in its defense of its infrastructure. Not just in the defense of its ideology, but because the ideology is built into the theory. Yeah.
I just was thinking that the sort of our whole conception of psychoanalysis is already sort of cleaved in two and always, you know, fighting itself as to how to think about itself in relation to whether it's for the one by one or whether it's for the political at large. And if I think back to when I was doing my PhD and training in psychoanalysis and having experience with people who were practicing psychoanalysts in NLS and the Freud Institute and very sort of illustrious people who were teaching me the theory and you know, I remember having conversations with them as somebody who I'm not a practicing psychoanalyst and I never intended to be. I wanted to or only ever sort of do the theory. I remember feeling how strange it was that there was this deep conceptual interest and this toolbox that, of course, Lacan and Freud offer you when thinking about politics. Yet there was this institutional force that was so strong that meant that the people who were kind of, on the one hand, giving you all of these amazing political ideas, were at the same time saying, oh, yes, but remember, this is not politics. Don't try and use it for politics. If you want to do politics, go and study, you know, radical thinkers, because this is not the place. And it was just so stiflingly bourgeois and just overwhelmingly embarrassing to hear the dissonance with these people who were ostensibly very intelligent people, but yet the institution had clamped them down to such a degree that you couldn't actually get them out of this way of thinking. And in fact, in the institution I was at, there was a sort of war going on between the political, philosophical side of people studying Lacan and the clinical people who were studying Lacan. And they hated each other to the point where the institution broke down and psychoanalysis was actually left the institution altogether. But this obviously, as we've seen, it's not gone anywhere. It's just only strengthened and strengthened the sort of battening down the hatches on trying to protect psychoanalysis as this kind of bubble of bourgeois interests. And it's so sad because for so many of us who want psychoanalysis to be this liberatory conceptual terrain, it gives this wrong impression to the outside world for people who don't know what psychoanalysis is about, that it becomes this very insular territory. And you know, the same kind of thinking that is permeates through the psychoanalytic world. What I found really scary and terrifying is how it's, you know, it's everywhere. It's not just psychoanalysis, it's philosophy, it's the academy, it's all of the, you know, people who previously consider themselves left-wing and on the right side of history and siding with oppressed peoples, and in the last 8 months, we've seen that that's not been the case. And, you know, the people who usually get their news from The Guardian are still thinking that that's the place where you get the truth. And what's really terrifying is to see people who you previously had, you know, thought were in your same frame of mind, having a completely different view of the world because they somehow can't relinquish this faith in the idea that we are getting the truth from our so-called vanguard of the sort of anti-establishment, you know, rhetoric, and still believing they can just read the national newspapers and they don't need to consult Instagram to see what the actual news is on the ground. And that's something that I personally have found extremely upsetting, frustrating, to see people in my immediate surroundings who are just still so ignorant and incapable of understanding, I mean, just on the basic level of how communications work, that you can't actually just know what's happening in the world from the mainstream news, because they still have this idea that it's any criticism of the mainstream news is somehow conspiracy theory, you know. But actually, the only way you're going to find out what's happening is if you listen to younger people, is if you see Instagram, is if you watch TikTok video. That's where the news came from. If we didn't have those means of communication, a lot of us would have not even known about this. And so it's just the complacency of this certain middle class block that has only now just started very, very slowly seeing that, oh, they can share a video, they can like an article, you know, they can speak out a little bit, and you notice it, just these little dots that are happening. People are suddenly starting to realize that it's safe now. They're putting their head above the parapet. But for months and months, no one's dared even, you know, say a peep.
You know, Isabel, I'm thinking, like, hearing what you just shared, and when Avgi framed it as like an attachment, there's this attachment. My mind is going towards this kind of place of, like, you know, is psychoanalysis as a field, like, kind of dominantly in the shadow of Freud's wish to be legitimized within institutions? And are we, like, operating in kind of in this attachment? There's like this feedback loop of, like, of course, these are my only legitimate sources of news. Of course, this is not politics, but I know politics, and kind of, like, you know, in its own echo chamber of saying, like, this is the truth and this is enough and everything else is too terrifying. Yeah, because I do feel like there's this kind of, if we also look at, like, what Carter was bringing in, you know, I'm currently located at a hospital and I have to go, actually, because I have a session, but, like, you know, so it's not acceptable for me to practice psychoanalysis in any way here. It's not going to be paid for. It's not, you know, whatnot. And increasingly, like, you know, there's all of these emails coming out from these psychoanalytic societies of, like, please help support to keep psychoanalysis alive and, you know, make this training module useful. So it's like psychoanalysis is itself killing itself because it's stuck in this quiescent state of, like, this is the, you know, where we are. And at the same time, you know, there's all of these pushes because of the political reality we live in and the political economy that's already taking it apart. And I really believe that Palestine is that through line that's kind of saying, like, yeah, you know, you're going to have to burst through this and push against it to the point that you're not going to be able to recognize yourself. Do you have enough trust and faith in what brought you towards the kind of, you know, something in this that, do you trust enough that there will be a reformulation of some sorts? Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, just some last words is, like, screw the hegemonic psychoanalytic, like, you know, field, and not in a pleasurable, joyful way. And, like, you know, bring on, like, the more folks that are speaking about saying, like, I'm not letting go of what psychoanalysis means to me and knowing what its capacity, where it can take us. And I think that is what Palestine does. You know, when folks are uploading their videos in the midst of just horror, they're also saying, like, I don't fully know right now what the hell is going on around me. That's most of them are posting, like, Ish had the Jahim, is this possible? Is this hell? Where are we? But, like, in insisting to, like, be present, they're trusting in some way, I feel, that they are like reconstituting themselves amongst the like breakage. Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I add something following on Razzan's comment? Like, I'm just
Absolutely.
thinking of like what she started with, and kind of like this idea that what's happening in psychoanalysis is happening everywhere. And kind of like, we're not that special. You know, we have, I mean, I love psychoanalysis. Like, you know, I spend a lot of hours in my day thinking about it, doing it, writing about it. But we're not that special. We're not outside the system, is what I hear Razzan saying. And if we want to try to do something outside of it, we're going to have to, we're not going to be able to convince, like, you know, I think Isabel, you said a phrase earlier, like to kind of like trying to get people to get out of that. We're not going to get anybody out of that. Like maybe some people will see what others are doing and become interested in it. But I think that I've been really preoccupied with like, is there a way to address this? Or do we just keep doing what we're doing? And whoever comes, and whoever doesn't. Like maybe there is a kind of split. Maybe there's a kind of break. Maybe this has to happen. Maybe we don't all go forward together. I mean, in some ways that's already happening. But what if, like, I think that's both an exciting thought and a frightening thought to us too. I mean, not just, and by us, I mean, who is the us? I'm talking about people who are kind of like on the same side of political understanding and its relationship to psychoanalysis. Like, what if we spent less of our energies on that project and put our energies in kind of like the kind of work that some of the people in this group are already doing, like kind of like moving in your own direction, moving in our own direction, and taking psychoanalysis to different places as opposed to trying to move the whole monolith.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I gave up on the Institute a long time ago, but it keeps happening. It's like phases of like, oh, gotta give up more, until, yeah, I'm really like an institutional abolitionist at this point. And some of you know, I think they just do a lot of harm, and I don't feel like analyses that are done on demand like that are like really helping people. I don't think people are really getting analyzed in the same way as when they come to it because they want to be analyzed. But I also think what Razzan said about us living in like Freud's kind of neurotic feedback loop of wanting to be accepted by the institutions in the medical field is also a good point, of course, because this is not unique to Freud, and this can also be like seen as a product of this like capitalist system and these kind of internal battles that people are always fighting, like, do I speak out, or do I do what I see is right, or, you know, say what I actually think is happening, not just with gossip, but like in general, or do I keep conforming so that I'm accepted, right? Accepted by the institute, and keep going in this like professional direction of what I should be doing. So I think his kind of neurotic feedback loop is kind of commonplace, you know.
And not just, but authoritarian, right? And I feel like that, you know, my obsession of the last several months is writing about this, of like, you know, that Freud was an authoritarian. He was a lot of other things, but he was that. And that, like, when you have a bunch of, you know, followers who interject an authoritarian, and then they go and like at a certain point, it just becomes culture, right? It's naturalized at the level of culture. And then people assume that it's essential to the nature of psychoanalysis when it's like essential to the nature of that dude. And that, you know, psychoanalysis is just a bunch of things to be interested in, and it doesn't belong to anyone, right? And like, you don't need to be in a lineage, and you don't, like, I mean, all, like, you don't, like, it just means being interested in questions.
Maybe
And I do
yours.
think, sorry, Lara, go on.
No, go ahead, Ian. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I wanted to pick up this idea that psychoanalysis isn't going to save us, you know, and I suppose my anger is an anger at the betrayal within the institutions of psychoanalysis, but there's also that anger about what happens in the left as it turns into kind of authoritarian cults, personality cults, anger at what happens in feminism when it turns into the so-called gender critical poisonous attacks on our trans sisters and brothers. That kind of thing, you know, that kind of turning, recuperation and turning of what should be something radical and progressive into something that is toxic and harmful to us is something that's happening in many places. So yeah, how can we understand the possibilities of psychoanalysis? And I think that comes through creating different kinds of institution, different kinds of network. We've got to do this collectively. We're not going to be able to navigate this on our own, you know, one by one. We've got to kind of build alternative networks and institutions. You know, this podcast is something of that. Yeah, okay. But we've also got to do our other political activities to give us a base from which to step back and understand what is also toxic about psychoanalysis. We've got to have other points of reference as well. For me, it's Marxism. For other comrades here, it'll be other forms of political analysis, but we desperately need those kind of collective places to think and analyze so that we're not, you know, yeah, leave it
there. There are times when folks will ask me, like, what is it about Fanon that spoke to you? And I, you know, it's hard to answer that, you know, holistically. But I think over and over and over again, what I've come back to is an unrelenting militant truth-telling, right? And I don't mean truth-telling in terms of like, oh, you know, we as people who engage in psychoanalysis have the truth. What I mean is material reality, right? Historical material reality. And there's something about that goes into the divestment question and statement that Avgi was saying, is that there's a way in which a militant truth-telling about what is happening, a naming of all of this, which all of us are doing a version of that, saying whether it's the betrayal or the repetition compulsion or the fact that psychoanalysis has always had violence. You know, it's a disciplinary method. It's always had violence, you know, embroiled in it. That's the reason why there was this sort of denazification of psychoanalysis. The movement to denazify psychoanalysis was because there's always been potential for psychoanalysis to be taken up by fascists and authoritarian sort of thinking. And so it begs the question of a sort of an inherent violence that's involved in any social order that would then reproduce a social order through a disciplinary technique. So that's not the surprise to me. So I suppose the divestment question is, of course, there's the psychic and affective part of that. There's also material part of that. But the way that I'm thinking about it is this question of like, what comes next? What do we do? If we learn from any sort of divestment movements, is this idea of refusing to be the stabilizing force for something that over and over and over again has caused harm. Let's face it, by the time people get to the point of divestment or boycott or anything like that, they've tried virtually everything, right? They've tried the cajoling, they've tried the reasoning, they've tried all these sorts of things. But for me, it does get to the point of what are the ways, both institutionally, individually, in collectives that look like anything, by the way, or in pairs, or however we want to think about this, to really refuse to engage in refusals to stabilize a social order that we know and this is the truth-telling, we know that the current hegemonic social order is one of death, that insists on death for the world, it insists on death for the earth, it insists on death for everything that is trying to create life otherwise, in conditions that by all possible means should not be viable to life. We see this both in Palestine, certainly in Gaza every single day. We see this with trans life. We see this in all the ways that people insist on life, despite every effort of hegemonic systems to make sure that their life is not viable, that will make sure that they die, that there are no futures that are there. So for me, it's a question of like, how do we continue to name this and tell the truth? I don't think that's a small act. And as somebody who, I knew this all along as somebody who was drawn to Fanon as a racialized subject, as a colonial subject, that the truth that is peddled doesn't matter, like ideological, and then having a Zionist smear campaign where literally something can be fabricated out of thin air about you and becomes the truth that then you are defending. There's a madness about it that is central to its viability, its longevity, right? And so the divestment also comes from maybe this, we keep doing what we are doing is refusing to budge even an inch about the things we know are historically and materially true, irrespective of the pressures that come from these systems whose job is to generate narratives that are coherent, that play on every level. We see this through the Israeli state propaganda. We see this through efforts to ban trans life. All of those things are are coherent in the sense of how they're propagated. But that, I guess, for me, the divestment is there should be no part of us that links up with that, even in defending our positions. And that's, for me, is like, no, we need to just create the future that we're trying to live in and that we imagine, and not get pulled into dialogue. I suppose that's what, it's a very long-winded way to be like, refuse dialogue, right? Because that's the truth. That's the truth-telling, at least for me.
I think that the tricky part is, I agree with everything you said. I agree about the refusal. I agree about taking these positions. The tricky part is like, how does one get there? Once you're there, right? But I'm just thinking of like how the engine of these systems kind of like gets kicked into gear even more forcefully when there's the attrition, or kind of like when it begins to sense that people are moving away. Like inside the form that this takes in psychoanalytic institutions is you start questioning, you start like pushing, they'll give you an award, they'll give you a position, they'll invite you to a panel, you're going to be on a committee, right? I mean, kind of like it works better with honey than it does with vinegar. How is it in English? Like that's what we say in Greek.
More
But
carrots, less sticks.
I'm sorry?
More carrots and less sticks.
Okay, yeah, that's it, right? That's the expression. But it's incredibly effective, because the seduction always comes with, come tell us, come change us, like we want your voice. And of course, like minorities are, I see Carter like laughing, minorities are the most vulnerable to this, because what do you want to hear more so than, we'll make room for you, like come change our minds. But I think that's where, for me, the question of reason and logic, change our minds, like it's the old Kantian premise of like, you woo, kind of like through logic, you convince, you make persuasive arguments, you show how things work. And kind of like for me, there is no arrival at that place, even for those of us who are kind of like feeling quite committed to it. Like there's always slippages, it's not linear. There's always moments where you feel, should I? Maybe. Like there's always the pull. And thankfully, if you have like good comrades, they can remind you, like it looks like that, but it's not like that. but sometimes like it's hard. So kind of like I also wonder, kind of like one of my hopes for our theories is also to begin to think about kind of like how these work, not just descriptively, but also what these forces catch us in and why we are responsive to them. Because once we're where you're describing, Lara, that's great. But the question, I have people reaching out to me all the time about where to train, how to think about like bringing their queerness or their kind of like aspects of their identity into their institutes. And like there's so much, hope is a human condition, not just a human attribute, it's also a human trap. And kind of like it's good, and it can also be the place where we're caught. So to me, it seems that that's another aspect of all this that kind of like makes what we're discussing extremely complicated. I mean, everybody knows it's very complicated, but even in that aspect.
You know what's been helping me a lot as I am thinking about the stuff that you're describing is I've been reading a lot about like Diogenes, or like kind of like writings about Diogenes, and this idea of, which is problematic in certain respects, but like the just the idea of like the need to be ridiculous to show how ridiculous other people are. And that like when you go to these psychoanalytic meetings, it's an extraordinary performance of wisdom. Like it's like they're like, and that's part of the sell, right? And the I feel like the moments in our history when I've seen change, right? If I think about like how did people successfully push against the homophobia of our profession, right? It wasn't even primarily the research. It was like people were like wilding out, you know what I mean? And like people were like showing up in costumes and like screaming at people, and like that like gave the lie to the authoritarian fundamentals of these institutions. And I think that it shows all these kind of receptive people that were interested in like, look how crazy these people are. Like this is madness over here. And that like, I don't know, there's something I found freeing in like giving myself the permission to just like be a little nuts to show how nuts all this is.
Yeah, and I also like what Ian said before about like we could be the center. Like why are we the people on the outskirts that are like the odd ones out, when really like what they're saying is like crazy and fucked up, you know? So it's like, why do they get to be the standard that then everyone else is judged by? And to flip the
And
script.
a lot of that I think has to do with our investments, and I think that I hear people saying things like psychoanalysis is sacred and you can't touch it and you need to keep the political out of it, just like confounding things that if you look at it, you're like, what isn't political? And why are you trying to force this thing into something? It's an idealized version of where we're all going to end up if we do our work, and our work being the thing that transforms us and changes us, but to an idealized place. And, yeah, hope is part of the condition, but I think there's also this investment in something that's going to be good and make us good. And so we have colonial repetitions and whiteness repetitions everywhere. And I think a lot of people that I'm in contact with don't really know somehow, or are refusing a knowing of that investment, because the Institute kind of feeds on that, to kind of like repopulate in its image, to make new, replicants. And so it's kind of like, this is the piece that I find within people that I speak to. It's like, what are you so invested in? And is it really about the institution? Is it really about psychoanalysis? Or is it some part of you that really needs to be good? And can we look at that? Can we trouble that?
I think, Molly, you're speaking to a certain type of purity. And I think purity is a function of white supremacy, right? And we started here, I mean, and the reason why we're here together is about Palestine. And I think this is precisely what we're brought back to, is that being able to say, how do we imagine that anything different than what we're seeing unfold in its supremacist logic could come out of Zionism, which is a settler colonial logic, right? That prioritizes purity and supremacy of human life over others. And I think there's something really important for us to keep coming at. The investments are not innocent. Just like the United States investment in the settler colony child, right, the state now known as Israel, comes from its own settler colonial investments. The same thing about the British Empire. Again, these things have that's what I mean about historical material truths, right? And the fact that they replicate and stabilize over and over and over again is because the investments are in a purity model. And what we've seen from history and from within our ranks, and of course in other disciplines as well, again, this is why I go back to, we're not very special, right? Is that when there are people within systems that refuse to replicate the supremacist logic of them, they will be cut out. They will be, there will be multitude of ways that you cut them out. They could be through seduction and co-optation, is bring them in and neutralize them, right? Let's demobilize and neutralize. We see that all the time. This is the sort of DEI logic of the world, is let's have the state sort of sponsor this and institutions being representative of the state. Or you have a version of, you know, getting rid of dissidents. And I think but again, if we keep going back to the logic itself and naming that, and sort of, maybe that's part of Avgi, of how do you get there, is a disciplined act. And this is where I'm going to reach into communism and Marxism, Ian, you'll be very happy, rather than my anarchist roots, of there's a disciplinary technique to reading these logics and understanding that they come out of purity and white supremacy, and that the investments themselves are not innocent. You know, we can't read them as innocent.
You're making me think, Lara, too, about the way that like the procedure of psychoanalysis so often is like one of domestication. You know, like that there's this premise that like we have these drives, and then the imperative is to actually like make sure you know about the way you're already controlling them, so that you can substitute a new way of controlling them that psychoanalysis believes in, right? And that, you know, there, like, you see these dialectics, you know, like between wildness and domesticity and purity and danger, like replicating again and again, and like how like the institution is always on the side of like the domesticated version, right? And that, you know, I'm increasingly persuaded, thanks to, in large measure, to many of you, like that's like, fuck them. Like, you know, be the wild feral version that they don't want anything to do with.
I think feral and wilding out are like important words in this conversation, because as you were saying this, Carter, I was thinking there is the adaptational model of psychoanalysis, where the goal is to help the patient adapt to the existing world. And then there is this sublimatory version of psychoanalysis, where you don't adapt to this word, but you sublimate kind of like the wildness into something else. And usually that something else kind of like loops back to something that is kind of like socially utile, kind of like aesthetically utile, kind of like it still works within the system. Maybe it doesn't kind of like challenge the system. What it does is it perhaps offers some other pleasure within the system. And kind of like, you know, you were talking about kind of like wilding out. And I was thinking about kind of like what happened on the listserv last year before your conference that you were running with Mary Kim Brewster, where kind of like you were met with something very racist on the listserv. And you kind of like finished your introduction to the conference by, I mean, I'll always cite this, like it was such a moment of you embodying exactly what you're talking about, with like saying woof. And there's something like kind of like so interesting about throwing us off the dialectic of, is somebody racist? Are they not racist? Like, are you going to humanize yourself? Are you going to argue that you should not be treated that way? And instead you kind of like sidestep that dialectic, and you actually step towards the wildness, which in some domain could be seen as like, oh, this is exactly what we were afraid of. Like, you know, the dehumanization like deepens. Or kind of like, I'm thinking of like how much pro-Palestinian activism right now looks to some people as if it is in fact exactly the confirmation that kind of like what is happening has a reason for it, right? Kind of like, and that, how much that actually pulls us back sometimes, pulls us back towards like, we don't want to confirm that stereotype. And part of what you're saying about kind of like feral and wildness and actually wolf is about taking the chance of stepping into that without being conducted by the fear of how it will be seen and how it will be used. And that to me is what divestment looks like. To be divested from not just being thought of as bad, good or bad, but just to move into a different domain. And kind of like, I just think that that's such a great example of that.
Yeah, that was a moment.
Can I give you a postscript on that moment? As I've been reading more about like cynic philosophy, I didn't, Avi, I'm sure you know this, and I did not, that the root of cynic is dog, right? And that part of the reason that Diogenes was called the cynic was because, he lived like a dog in a barrel. He was surrounded by dogs. He's portrayed as being surrounded by dogs. And there's this sort of, all the stuff about him might be apocryphal, who knows? But like, there's this famous moment where, people are making fun of him and calling him a dog. He goes, "I'll show you a dog," and he just pisses on all of them. And, I think that's yeah. I feel like the modes of activism that I'm seeing, like from, like kind of radical trans activists and like, Palestinians who won't quit, like, yeah, there is that just like, there's no amount of respectable that I could be that would ever lead you to really treat me and people like me differently. So like, like let me roast you for what how inhumane you for somebody who's so obsessed with their own humanity, like look how inhumane you are, right, in the way that you make me an animal. Yeah,
and support genocide.
Yeah.
Well, we'll invite Fanon back in, right? It's the racist that creates the inferiorized. That's right. And that's the thing. So divestment also means, what does it mean to withdraw? We want to say consent, to withdraw the ability for the racist to use us, because there is, and this is the sort of this, I'm not the first person to say this, of course, that Zionism is tied up in Palestine, in Palestinians. And what does it mean for us to divest from the racist ability to create us in their vision, and to do all the mechanics and marshal all the things we know from the state, from institutions, psychically, propaganda, to further that notion, right? I think these are the questions that we're asking when it comes down to Palestine. I think that's what we're seeing. When we're seeing these students saying, and I've seen this mischaracterized, right? When folks are saying, oh, these students don't really understand what's at stake and all of that. It's like, these students completely understand. And they're saying, it is with our understanding of the stakes that we are doing this, because a world that I want to live in does not include one in which two rogue states in the world are allowed to commit a genocide that is broadcast for everybody to see, to go back to Isabel's point. Like, if you really want to see, it's being broadcast. And that type of world is not worth living. So I'm willing to wager everything. What's the point of an Ivy League, right, degree that can be withheld from me anyway, by the way, like Harvard has done, right? Mm-hmm. What's the point of that if then I'm also saying that I will sign up to a world that depends on the degradation of some for the success of others, for the viability of others? That's the essential logic that we keep coming back to. And I think this is what has become clear for at least those of us who are attuned. And for those who have not come along yet, yes, I agree. I think some people won't be coming along for the ride, right? And that, but also for us to see that it's not because there wasn't an invitation. It's because there's an ideological misattunement in which they were invested. And that ideological misattunement in which they're invested is not innocent, and one that also includes the wholesale slaughter of people, Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but across Palestine, right? In the 8+ months that we've seen this happening, there have been thousands of Palestinians who have been detained without trial, who have been tortured, who've been sexually assaulted. And now we have also proof of an actual beheaded baby, right? Not the propaganda that we've been seeing. And so this is, I think, where we're at. It's like laying bare. How do we divest from the, if that possibility is there, then the ability for the racist to name the conditions of that must be severed, right? Psychically, materially, all the things we're seeing. This is what escalate for Gaza means, right? Going after the machine that creates the bombs which is the new campaign that folks are doing, right, is against Maersk. That is part of it. So I do think it's, how do we also reimagine that there's a tool at every level of this? If we understand psychoanalysis, it's to understand how things get lodged inside of us at various levels of being, and how that flows through us, and how we then, create social relations and political relations based on that. And so what does it mean also to be expansive and say, if that's how this was formed, then we must disrupt at every level of this machine, right? And that's, our level might include institutions, might include other things, might include leaving entirely, might include resignations, might include saying, this award is bullshit because you stand behind nothing that you say. And so I refuse to be engaged in it.
I mean, subjective destitution is supposed to be the point of psychoanalysis, but actually that should be the point of politics as well. And I mean, this is what you're saying, Lara, is basically people are having to subjectively destitute themselves. And what we're saying is, for some people, it's much easier to break those bonds with all the sort of symbolic shackles that they had previously. And of course, for students and younger people, they've clearly found that easier. But what we're seeing is that, of course, people are so invested in their jobs and their lives, as middle class people, being seen to be saying the right things, and thinking that because their peers are saying those things, that they must be okay because this is the sort of respectable median. And it's so interesting to see how, actually the people who are able to break free more easily are precarious people. If you're not employed by anyone, if you don't have any obligations to any institutions, if you're living in poverty, if you have experiencing what most people in this country actually do experience, which is bullshit, it's easier to go, what, fuck you. Why am I even believing anything you're saying anyway? And, in a way that's heartening, because it means that there has been a feeling, as in the midst of all the horror, that there is something that is constituting such a thing as a people, and you can see that every time when you're going on a march, and every time when you see people posting, that you feel this thing of, okay, so there is a people now that wasn't there 8 months ago. And that is extremely, extremely powerful, and something that we have to hold on to and really galvanize, because it's very tangible. It's very noticeable that you're seeing alliances between different struggles, between, it's Angela Davis, what she said, it's alliances between struggles. That's what we have to always build on. And this, the one thing you can say is that we are seeing that, and that's something that we have to be really positive about and bring forth, because it's so easy to just feel so hopeless and so horrified that you just want to switch off, can't take anymore, it's too awful, which is happening with most older people, is that they don't want to engage, they don't want to see any videos of bloodied babies anymore, and they say, well, it's not good for you because what can you possibly do about it? And that kind of subjective destitution, they're never going to do to themselves because they're too comfortable, essentially. And that's what we're fighting against, is that it's the comfort levels, is that there's too much investment in your own comfortable state of ignorance. And unfortunately, we have to become more uncomfortable and more aware of our complicity, and more, feeling uncomfortable with ourselves every day for the fact that we can go about our business and be safe and warm and have food. And we have to feel, unfortunately, more guilty about that than we have done previously.
No, I think that critical to what you're saying, Isabel, and to what you were talking about, Lara, and talking about like restabilization, is also how psychoanalytic institutions have responded to that. So I did want to say something very concrete about that, and to say that kind of like a little bit about what happened at my institute, which is that as people started like posting things about the genocide, back in October, we were told that we're not allowed to use the word genocide on the listserv to describe what's happening to Palestinians. And when there was pushback around that, they closed down the listserv for the safety kind of like talking about kind of like safety, kind of like frameworks for the safety, because the community, there was too much upheaval and people were getting too upset. And it was, of course, extremely upsetting. And they replaced that with a moderated listserv that, of course, lets nothing political ever go through anymore. And as a result of which, many of us are not engaging with a listserv very much anymore at all. So kind of like here is a space, I think that it's an important reminder that kind of like that psychoanalytic institutions will not just speak or not speak, or what do they say, what do they acknowledge, they will take active stances on suppressing speech and making it, I've heard from candidates who have been threatened that they're never going to be able to build a practice, that they're never going to be graduating. Yeah. Heard from people who have reached out to me and have kind of like said, I want to speak, but I'm afraid. Kind of like people who really want to speak and people who are really afraid. Of course, anybody who speaks, I think, does so under kind of like some degree of concern. So I don't think that there are people to whom it doesn't cost anything. And I certainly don't want anybody listening to this recording imagining that those who are on the front lines are doing so without cost to themselves, because of course it is very costly. I mean, Lara, you have been on the forefront of that for a while now. But I do want to say that analytic institutes are exerting force in making sure that these conversations do not happen. And I think that's really important to just register as part of the restabilizing efforts.
Yeah. I mean, there's something in the dynamic of the protests that these institutions really hate. And you can see a flip side of that. One of the psychoanalytic institutions here in Britain issued a statement about Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd. And then they had a discussion later on about Gaza. Someone pointed out that they had made a statement about Black Lives Matter, and the institution suggested that they take down the statement about Black Lives Matter. You know, so there's a kind of logic to that closing down of politics altogether when something fearful happens and they're faced with reality, they're faced with the real, they're faced with something that they can't deal with. And we're seeing this at the moment in the University of Manchester, where we have one of the largest encampments, student encampments for Gaza in the UK, where the university is in the process now of celebrating its 200th anniversary, 1824 to 2024, absolutely desperate to stop the encampment in case it disturbs the image of the university. So it's kind of like this kind of like prestige question is being challenged and broken by the students who are saying, no, we're here to do something different. And the encampment has become a space where other people are coming in from outside. That is, it's breaking the boundaries between the enclosed university space as a protected space where we just do scholarly work and the real world. And I think that that's a real possibility in the dynamic of the movement to speak about genocide and to act about genocide and to speak about it on the streets and mobilize people, is it breaks the institutions and opens the space for something different. I mean, yeah, here it's about spraying red paint on the university, not pissing on the university administrators, but it's doing that work of breaking things open.
This puncturing of the boundary, the border that you're describing between the university and the outside is so critical. And I'm saying this as somebody who's situated at NYU, a university that actually built a literal wall, kind of like to prevent an encampment.
And you know, we can sort of look and laugh because we can see it in its full, in clarity, what they're doing, right? When you erect an open air prison and enclose students in, that you are replicating precisely the settler state's logic around what happens, especially in Gaza, right? But again, the forward motion of this is to say that there are no contradictions to the impeccable logic of a racist. taking down the Black Lives Matter statement is the most honest movement for them. Because for them, it's not just an undoing, right? It's an honesty that says, in some ways, we didn't mean that either. There was a coercive element of that. This is a logical extension. If us, having to do this means we have to do that, I'd rather not do that, right? So there's something like very validating to me, very validating when these sorts of things happen, because those of us who've been working find those maneuvers to be incredibly dangerous for the reasons that all of us have alluded to, including the air or the sort of front that these spaces are safe for folks, that there is institutional support for structural changes that should be the logical extension of a BLM statement, right? Not just an empty, we're against murder. That what does that actually mean? What are the actual asks that are involved in that? What are the structural pieces that we're asking for? So it goes back to Isabel's point about like there's a way in which rendering oneself destitute, but there's a way in which the imagination of the racist can never allow for that. That's the longevity of their, of their project. On this note, one of the many tweets that this Zionist smear campaign has went after of mine is one in which I crib Amilcar Cabral's idea of class suicide and call for professional suicide. And because racists are literalist sensationalists, and also largely uneducated in the leftist tradition, could not read the parallel that we're making. But I think this is precisely what you're saying, whether it's rendering our professional spaces uninhabitable in the ways that they imagine themselves to be. They're already uninhabitable. We know this. The many compromises that those of us who have been under the thumb of oppression have had to do to even exist in those spaces, and the compromises that folks who genuinely want us in those spaces have also had to do to make that possible, right? Already renders the entire logic a lie. It's a fraud and it's a lie, right? And I think this is the piece that's being uncovered when we say, if we want to render ourselves destitute, I think people end up thinking of themselves as truly being destitute. And I'm going on the line here of being a little bit cheesy, but there's nothing more enriching to me, right? There's nothing that has sustained my life truly than being able to divest from the lie that my richness is going to come from being committed to a system, a project, an institute, a process, whatever it is, that fundamentally constitutively relies on the displacement and dispossession of others. That truth-telling, right, that destitute, and maybe this is where imagination comes in. Why do we render that destitution? Perhaps it looks like that when we're under the, under the crush of these systems. And also, this is what abolitionists have always taught me, is that how do you create infrastructure? And I think there's a version of that we're all speaking to, and Avgi specifically invited in. What do we do, right? What type of infrastructure do we create? These students are showing that for us, like you're saying, Ian, right? They're already in those encampments. Those encampments aren't a future promise. They're a current day instantiation of the world that they're saying we want to create, right? And that's, I think, part of this idea is how do we bring that to bear? That crisis is important. And nobody more than Avgi has taught us that.
But as you're saying this, Lara, I'm thinking of the crisis that's created by the students. I'm thinking of the startle with the wolf. And I'm also thinking of like how when you were describing and kind of like the absurdity of taking out the BLM statement, which kind of like it's more honest, but it's also like so ridiculous. Like kind of like I absolutely agree with you, Lara, that it's more honest. But I'm also thinking institutions, I mean, we all know this here, but it needs to be said, don't have to work this way. And I'm thinking of kind of like what Division 39 has done in its board, where kind of like the statement kind of like of supporting trans rights has actually been put to very concrete use to support trans life on our listserv by refusing to post content that is transphobic and which is undermining of gender diversity. And that has, of course, generated a huge crisis on the listserv. But Division 39's leadership, of which kind of like Lara is at the helm, but kind of like others have also been very critical and have refused to respond to that crisis by closing it down, and have actually, instead of taking down a statement, they have said we need to be consistent with the statements we've put out. And therefore, we are actually going to implement different policies to ensure that no transphobic kind of like soul-killing project ends up on our listserv. And that has been kind of like, it's a reminder that institutions are also, don't have a will of their own. They have conservative energies, but we can, like, when you're in a position of power, you can always use that power to undermine them. And I think that that's the responsibility of everyone who has some power in an institution. I expect that from our colleagues. It doesn't mean that it will be delivered, and I'm grateful when it happens, but it is something that I think we should all expect from people who have positions of power in our organizations. And I learned that from you, Lara, from you kind of like doing that and insisting on that no matter what the cost.
I just wanted to add, like, in terms of the doing part of it, that, you know, my listserv at my institute didn't get shut down. Maybe unfortunately, I don't know. But it's still, you know, doing its thing. But one of the first things that came forward from in October was like a pretty big rant, and then a lot of support for that rant. And so I responded with just like a list of resources and an invitation, if folks want to talk, reach out to me, and like maybe we can start a reading group. It was like the sort of like most non-neutral thing, because I didn't want to also rant in that space, but I had a lot of people reach out to me and contact me, and we have a group that we've been meeting now since then. And there's been, through that, like galvanizing other actions that we do together. And so in the face of like a lot of very personal attacks that happened on the listserv, there's been actually a core group where we can, you know, disalienate with one another, basically, you know, and like deconfound with one another, and not in an attempt to convince anybody else. That's not worth it, in my opinion. But there are, you know, invitations out there for people who are like, I'm not sure like how to speak, or I'm really sure, or whatever it is. But to bring people together, I found that was really useful. It didn't fix anything, but it built something new, just sort of in that realm.
It's really good to hear of these different initiatives. I mean, they kind of like, they're energizing, and they give us examples of what we could do in our own places. That's really good. I wanted to just say something about subjective destitution that Isabel raised. I think it's also really important that we, and I don't want to turn this into a therapy group, but, you know, recognize that we're divided subjects, subject to these kind of ideological forces, contradictions, splitting, sense of division, that we're not pure, beautiful souls, you know, that have the truth within us and are able to speak the truth all the time in an unmediated way. No, we're subject to these conflicts, and it's, as Lara was saying, it's the masters, it's the colonial masters that want to make it seem as if they're pure and undivided, you know. And when the state of Israel was formed, say when the Balfour Declaration was issued, Jews in Britain knew that this was an anti-Semitic endeavor, apart from anything else. The Board of Deputies of British Jews were against the Balfour Declaration because they knew that it was part of an anti-immigrant racist move that had been going on since the Aliens Act of 1905, which targeted Jews first of all as the horrible kind of like necessary to be excluded and, if possible, eliminated outsiders. So the kind of European racism and our complicity in that European racism here in Britain, just speak about Britain here, is there at the core and needs to be dealt with as well. Our own complicity in this and our own dividedness is something that we need to look at and work at, and at times feel really shitty about, and be able to get through that and get to the other side with the help of our comrades to keep on.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I reached out to everyone. It was like what Isabel said, we need to start feeling more guilty. I had to like buy some things for the house, so I like went to the dollar store and I was like walking around with my little cart and just like looking at all this like plastic crap. And I was like, what is this that I'm in this world that has all this like crap, like flooded with crap, and then people are being like blown to pieces, and I just couldn't even function anymore. So I wrote you all. It's like I have to do something. Like, what can I do?
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Vanessa.
And here, if that's okay with folks.
Yeah.
Great to see you here.
That's good with me. Yeah, thank you so much. This has been so powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Free Palestine.
Yeah,
Well-
free Palestine.
Isabel, it's so good to finally meet you and be in space with you.
Oh, you too. It was really, really great to see you and to listen to you and all of you as well. It's just been amazing. Thank you so much.
Rest.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.